Back on the Morning Brew, Larry Ahrens, along with Stephen J. Westman, our co-host today. And we're all back to business. Man, the freeway was loaded. Everybody's going back to work today. It seemed that way anyway. Rachel Sams is here. She's back to work. She's editor-in-chief of Albuquerque Business First. How are you?
I'm doing great.
Nice
Glad to be here. Always good to be here.
Everybody's back to work and
Yes.
get a little work in before the holiday thing kicks in.
We're trying.
Yeah. Last week you had an energy conference.
We did. It
Talk about
was
that a little
really interesting. This was the first time we've done this event. We decided to do it just because energy is such a big part of the economy of New Mexico, makes up a huge part of our general fund every year. And it has also been one of the areas, in terms of oil especially, that has been growing. As our economy has slowed down, the growth in oil has been a pretty major factor in what growth we have been able to see. So that made us want to give our readers and our audience a sense of where is energy going? Is this going to continue? So we brought in a great speaker. His name was Chris Hansen, and he's from a global firm called IHS. And he's based in Denver. So that meant he had an international perspective, but also knew the Southwest very well, which was really neat. We had about more than 200 people come out for this event. And it was a real mix, everyone from people who work in oil down in Artesia and Hobbs, people from Farmington who work in natural gas, and then just people who don't have any tie to energy at all, but maybe want to do business with energy folks and just want to learn about where it's going. So what did we learn? We learned a lot about the future of energy. Already it's a big job contributor in the nation as our energy production has gone up in the past few years. Since 2009, the U.S. has really been producing a lot more oil and natural gas. And the speaker, Chris Hansen, really couched that as a major competitive advantage, even for all of North America, that we're now doing more production of our own energy and relying less on imports. And he really sees that continuing for many years to come. He talked a lot about, particularly in terms of natural gas, the huge amount of reserves that we have. As he described it, even without a lot of new technology to get to natural gas in new ways, we've got decades worth to see us through. He expects that the number of jobs from energy, which I think is about 2 million nationally now, is going to double in the next decade or so.
Wow.
Yeah, it's pretty incredible.
Wow.
There are all these new ways, right, to get oil and natural gas out of the ground.
Stuff.
It is really, really fascinating. And you know, of course, renewable energy is a growing part of the mix too, things like solar and wind. That's growing rapidly, but it's still a relatively small part of the whole pie. We talked about that a little bit. And one of the most interesting things in the entire talk, he talked about his company has done some analysis of public sentiment around some of the new technologies coming up in energy, particularly fracking. And of course, fracking is extremely controversial. It's drilling in new ways to break up shale rock and get natural gas out of it. And of course, there are a lot of environmental concerns about it, a lot of health concerns about it. And his firm has done some really interesting work tracking public sentiment about fracking on Twitter. They've used Twitter to look at where people are talking about it and what they're saying. And what they found was that as there's more discussion about fracking on Twitter, the more negative the words are that are being used about fracking, the more regulation is then proposed in that area to try to get a handle on it. And so that's something that the energy industry is seeing this research for the first time. They're realizing that the people who oppose fracking have done a really good job of getting their message out on Twitter, and now they're trying to figure out, we have a message too, what the heck are we going to do? So it's a very interesting time, and no one really knows how it's going to play out, how the energy business is going to use that knowledge. But it was fascinating to see the way that Twitter is actually shaping what's going on out there.
That truly is the national conversation, isn't
Right? It was really interesting. You could tell that people in the audience were just kind of spellbound
Yeah.
by thinking about this. And one of the people in the audience actually tweeted, "Your tweets are being analyzed," which is pretty funny.
Of course,
Very
of course.
funny.
We had a great audience. They had great questions. Of course, one of the things that everybody wanted to know was what's going to happen with gas prices. Everyone wants to know that, right?
That's our most visible sign of energy.
Exactly,
and its
exactly.
costs.
That's one of the places where it hits all of us in the pocketbook. So most of the people there were pleased to hear what he had to say about that, which was that he expects gasoline prices to stay in the $3 to $4 for the time being. Another great question was about when can we expect transportation, like our transportation, the vehicles we drive, to really switch over from fossil fuels, gasoline, to alternative forms of energy. And Chris Hansen talked about how you see the demand increasing for like electric vehicles, right? You
Right.
see all the interest. Everybody wants a Tesla.
Right.
That's obviously one of the hot ones out there. But he talked about because our whole infrastructure, everything down to gas stations, is still so focused on gasoline, it really will be a while, even with all of these new electric models coming onto the market, before the bulk of the transportation we use begins to switch over. And he actually expects it won't be till 2025 until that really starts to happen. So over a decade from now.
That make generations.
Right, right.
VCR users.
Yeah, exactly, right?
Sorry, mother. Wow. I was down in Carlsbad and Hobbs over the summer, and all of those almost migrant workers
Yes.
who were filling up the hotels and the trailer parks and renting homes. The towns are booming again.
They really are.
The restaurants are full. It's such a weird way of watching how the economy is really, everything is working for it.
Yeah,
So,
absolutely, absolutely. One other question that people had was, what's going to happen with oil prices? Because that's a big
Right.
part of the reason that there's been such a boom in oil production down there, is that prices have been high for the past couple of years. Now we've seen a little bit of a dip, so everybody's wondering what's going to happen next. The speaker actually predicted that through, I believe, 2024, he really expects oil prices to essentially be on an upward curve. So that bodes pretty well for those economies down there. And, that it just shows that there's probably going to need to be more hotels, more homes built,
Right.
as more people are going to be coming in there.
interesting timeline that, quarter way through the century.
Yeah, definitely, definitely.
Did the Keystone Pipeline come up?
It did. That's a great question.
Because tomorrow they're going to do a vote in Congress on this, and the president says he's going to veto it, but it sets up an interesting challenge. But what do
It
you say
really
about it?
does. Someone did ask about that. They asked specifically, with the Keystone Pipeline being so much in the news and the really intense debate about whether we should build it. The question was, do you expect pipeline construction to continue? Do you expect that to be possible in the future? And Chris Hansen actually said he thought he did. And the reason he gave was very interesting. His reasoning was that when you look at alternative forms of transportation, of energy,
Yeah.
Specifically rail, there have been some really high-profile accidents with
Sure.
rail transport. So he saw that as a reason that ultimately, as this discussion goes on, it's likely that there will be more pipeline construction. And another really interesting kind of political question that came up was carbon emissions and carbon taxation and that sort of thing. You generally think about that as something that a lot of people in energy oppose. But the way Chris Hansen actually saw it as being something that's likely to come to pass, and the reason he gave was that people in business want certainty. They want to know what to expect. So if this is constantly hanging over their heads, will we or won't we have these
Right.
new kinds of taxes? That makes it very difficult to plan for what they're going to do. That
I
they'd
see.
rather know, was his explanation of that.
Oh, that's very interesting.
Yeah, that was a little bit counterintuitive to me, so I thought that was
Yeah.
fascinating.
All I know is right now we're kind of making OPEC squirm a little bit, which is a
Right?
good thing.
Right? Yeah.
Which is a very good thing.
That was really one of the things that he emphasized, is how much the production that we're doing is giving us more independence from some of the
Exactly.
concerns around oil production in the rest of the world.
Wow, this is fascinating stuff. I'm glad you guys staged this because it's a great conversation. We kind of live in a little bubble here in Albuquerque. We don't have the energy industry
So true.
right out down the road. It's up in the Four Corners, and it's out in the southeastern part of the state. But it's so key. And you're right. I think they've kept us afloat during this downtime.
It's a really interesting point. It is so true that the energy business is such a massive part of what
Yeah.
goes on in business in our state, but we really don't see it here in Albuquerque because the production is not here. And so we just wanted to kind of dive into where it's going to go from here, because it is
Beautiful.
such an important economic contributor.
Rachel, really great conversation. Thank you for being here today.
Always great to be here.
Thank
Thanks
you.
for having me.
I'm glad you guys could meet each other.
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely.
Will this
Great.
happen again next year?
That's what we're planning, yeah.
Good.
I mean, there's enough change for sure.
Good.
Awesome.
Rachel Sams with us, editor-in-chief of Albuquerque Business First. I think that discussion was really valuable.
Wow.
We'll be back in a moment. Steve and Jay on some nonprofits that you need to know about. That's next here on the Morning Brew.